Good afternoon. Although I'm not able to join you today, I still wanted to connect with all of you before you begin. Let me start by thanking each of you for making the commitment to be part of this important committee as we push for equitable, inclusive, and sustainable growth in our region. I want to acknowledge our partners who are with us on this journey, CODA, Morpsey, and Franklin County. Thank you for your dedication to transforming our region. LinkUS is our vehicle for reimagining infrastructure in Central Ohio while tearing down racist and discriminatory policies. Through this initiative, we will drive infrastructure strategy in ways that move all people forward by embracing equity as the cornerstone of our decision making. As members of the steering committee, I ask you to think, innovate, and collaborate through an equity lens. Thank you again for accepting the charge of this coalition. We're in a unique position to act, and I'll need all of your support, guidance, and partnership to help make this happen. With that, have a great meeting, and I'll turn it back over to the team.
And with that, we certainly want to thank our co-chairs for helping to set the stage for our meeting today. And if we can start our presentation, I will let you know that, hey, I'm Gail Saunders, and I am your facilitator for today's meeting. Very excited, as everyone has said, to begin to work together on this such important project. I lead the communications for the Lincus program in partnership with my communication leaders from CODA, Morpsey, the county, and the city of Columbus. And I'm also with the Saunders PR group. So let me set the stage a little bit about why we are here. Many of you know this bridge, and you were actually involved with this project. It is the Longstreet Bridge and Cultural Wall. This was phase 1 of the Columbus Crossroads project. It is considered one of the most important infrastructure projects in the city. We see this as a reconnection to community. The Longstreet Bridge was a bridge that restored the King Lincoln District, linking it back to downtown. And you remember that cultural wall? It features 139 images honoring 142 community heroes and sheroes, those places and institutions, past and present, who really made a significant and positive impact, a lasting impact to the King Lincoln and Discovery districts. Thousands of people came to that dedication to celebrate the rebirth of the community and to begin to heal from some of the past injustices of redlining and building of federal highway system that had such a negative impact on the neighborhood. And that impacted my husband's community. He lived in that community when that highway separated his neighborhood. So when you think about that wall, let me give you some additional context about the significance of this bridge as we move forward to our next slide. There are more than 590,000 highway bridges in the United States. In 2016, the Longstreet Bridge was featured on the cover of the fiscal year 2017 U.S. Department budget. Now that's significant. Why? Because the former U.S. Transportation Secretary, Anthony Foxx, said that this effort to reconnect and revitalize a community divided by past transportation policies is a compelling example of how transportation can create or eliminate opportunity gaps in our nation. And so as a result of that bridge, later in 2016, Columbus beat out 77 other cities to win the Smart City Challenge. And just a few weeks ago, many of you know this, the city was awarded a $25 million grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation for phase 4 of the Columbus Crossroads project that will reconnect downtown and our South Side neighborhoods. Most importantly, the Longstreet Bridge has been a catalyst for hundreds of millions of dollars in new investment for housing, office space, retail in the King Lincoln district. So if you've not driven down Long Street for a while, I suggest you get over there. You might consider doing so because you can see the transformation of that community real time. And so when we think about the Long Street Bridge and the impact that it has had on our community, it is our North Star. For the profound impact we want the Lincus program to have in restoring connections, building ladders of opportunity for all people, and in transforming our region. Lincus will help us create great places, increase equitable access to opportunity, accommodate future growth in productive ways, improve economic vibrancy, and shape the future of reimagining the region for shared prosperity. Now, we can't do this alone. It's going to take all of us working together to get us there. And the collaborative effort and commitment of this group, the work that you will do as a steering committee, will help shape the future of this city and the region for decades to come. It is transformational, not only for the city, but we're talking about impacting people's lives. So we really want to thank you for being part of our steering committee, because we know the work that you do and what we're going to accomplish together, it's critical to move this region forward. So before I share and walk you through the agenda and talk about what we can expect today, I want you to do something for us, please. If you would put your name, your title, and the affiliation of your organization or company you represent, if you can put that in the chat, we want everyone to see just the diverse group of people who have joined us today. So as you're putting that in the chat, I'm going to walk you through our process and what we're going to expect today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, bring you up to speed on the Lincus Leadership Coalition and the Lincus program in general. Then you're going to hear from Rory McGinnis, who's going to share insights and highlights from a recent mobility report. Thank you so much for putting your information in the chat. We see you. Thank you so much. Then you're going to hear from Jennifer Walton from CODA, who will share community information as part of the Momentum for Transformational Mobility. And our partner, Stephen Stansberry, will walk you through some of what our peer cities are doing, how they are bringing to bear a new way of building infrastructure in their city. But they also, he's also going to talk about some lessons that we can learn from our peer cities. And then you're going to hear from the planners and those leading our corridor projects on how we are aligning our efforts, and also talk about more infrastructure programming. And of course, we want to hear from you. So we're going to give a lot of time for feedback, a discussion and exchange. And we're going to ask you some key questions as you're thinking about and as you're going through these presentations. Please keep these questions in mind. What are some key results we should be driving toward in this work as you're listening to these presentations? Are there any other program elements that we've not talked about that you think are important? Jot them down. And then are there any other specific priorities that we should be using to inform our work as we move toward an action plan for implementation? And so, as I mentioned, we are going to have an opportunity for dialogue and discussion today. So you can put your questions in the chat as we go along, or you can hold them until we get to our dialogue and Q&A session. So you do have a choice, but we are going to give you an opportunity to share your voice, and we want to hear from you later. So as we go to our next slide, I want to talk about the Lincus program and the Lincus Leadership Coalition. Your role as members of the steering committee is clear. We're asking you to help shape a recommendation for programming and funding to help take action on this work. You're going to receive quite a bit of information today. And so, as I mentioned before, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your mics closed until we get to our Q&A session. And then if you have any questions in the meantime, we can certainly put them in the chat. This is Central Ohio's Transformational and Comprehensive Prosperity and Mobility Initiative. And as you can see, we want to make sure that we're providing equitable mobility options for our residents and our visitors, ensure access to jobs, promote economic growth, and improve sustainability. And as we do that, we want you to know that the work that we're talking about doing, we have some foundational elements that have helped us get to the implementation stage. You heard Executive Director Murdoch mention Insight 2050, Next Gen, and Insight 2050 quarter concepts. All of those reports and all of that research and all of that data is great work to set the stage for our LinkUS effort. We see LinkUS as the implementation work and the stage to get these efforts and bring them to life. So now I'd like to do a quick poll. You know, we want to see who else we have in the room here. So I am going to ask you to put in the chat if you have participated in any of the Insight 2050 or Next Gen or Insight 2050 quarter concepts. I think Nadia, if you could do that for us, that would be wonderful. And that would be a yes or no if you have. Nadia, if you are there, if you go to the polls in your area, I think you can get to the poll when you logged in. But as we're doing that, okay, yes. And I know, Mr. Steiner, you were chair of some of those. So thank you so much. We see a lot of saying no, not directly. If you participated in any of our stakeholder or public engagement meetings for the corridor projects, please put that in as well. Thank you. Thank you. So we've got a good mixed bag of people who have participated, people who participated in everything, which is wonderful, and those who have not had an opportunity. And so that's the purpose of our steering committee. We want to make sure that we have a very rich, diverse group of individuals who can help guide us and guide us through this work. And as we're working through this, we want to talk about our priorities as we address 21st century challenges. The Lincus priorities and the priorities of our region are all about improving conditions and helping us maintain our competitive advantages. And so as you can see, we have 6 priorities, 6 principles that we follow, equity being number 1, and we drive that throughout everything that we do. Workforce advancement, innovation, affordability, economic development, and sustainability. And we'll talk about each of those more in depth as we go through our programmatic elements for you. And so when we think about why we're here, this is why you are here. I just want to take a little time to talk about exactly what we need to do to meet those LincUS priorities and those milestones that we talked about earlier. We're talking about implementation. It requires a dedicated funding stream. And we know that we're going to have a funding stream to match the federal dollars. And we're asking you to help us do that. Our peer cities are already moving toward their own comprehensive mobility infrastructure programs that include broader systems beyond just transit. And you're going to hear more about that from Stephen Stansbury in just a little bit, but we are going to ask you to help identify our desired results, our program elements, our budget, and again, a funding strategy with options on how we can move forward to implement the LincUS program. And of course, we need to align our community and our civic leadership to ensure that we have support for any future funding efforts. And so how are we going to do that? Well, we have a 3-part step process to answer those 3 fundamental questions: the why, the what, and the how of a transformational mobility investment program. First, I want to start with the why. When we talk about the why, we've done quite a bit of information before. We've talked about the foundational work that has gotten us to that point. The why is rooted in those studies and those plans that we talked about, Insight 2050, Next Gen, Insight 2050 Corridor Project, the work that Morpsey and CODA have done to get us to this point, and the city to get us to this point. And you're going to hear about a mobility report that also gives us the why we need to move forward with this plan. And the what, when we talk about the what for us, it really is really focused on the investments that will require us to move forward. And those investments, as we said before, certainly include a funding option to help us get there. And then when we talk about the what, we certainly have to go to the how. We are now beginning with the creation of this leadership coalition. The executive committee met last week, and we're here today. We've convened you today to begin your such important work. This process answers the what of the work, and it really is about identifying how we will advance equity in all of our systems of programs, and also support the cities and the region's equity agenda in how we identify and bring to the forefront those investments that will have the greatest impact on addressing our needs as a city and a region. And then the how. It's how we will fund the Lincus program. This group will ultimately be asked to present a recommended plan to the executive committee. Our goal is for the Lincus Coalition to endorse an action plan that articulates both the elements of the program and the strategy for funding and implementing it. So we've got big work to do, but we can do it together. And we know that we have a structure in place to help us get there. So I want to give you an understanding of the Lincus Leadership Coalition structure. I'll walk you through that very quickly. First, we have the Lincus Coalition is composed of 3 committees. We have the Executive Committee, which is, they meet 3 times over the course of the next year into early 2022. It will provide the guidance and strategic direction on the course of this work. We have our Steering Committee, who very essential to presenting this work. And again, you represent a very broad representative group of business, community, and civic leaders. And so your work, as you're meeting over the course of 5 meetings from now to January 2022, you're going to really work through the technical details of the program development and funding options. Your work will be presented to the executive committee for final action. And then the executive and steering committees are supported by the administrative committee, and that is comprised of administrative and technical staff from all of our partners, Morpsey, CODA, Franklin County, and the city. And of course, we have a larger team supporting the staff with consultants, and we're developing the analysis and options to be considered throughout this process. And so our co-chairs, Director Gallagher, Executive Director Murdoch, and President Pinkerton all serve on the executive committee. And that's important because we want to ensure that there's ongoing communications and that alignment between the two. And so as we think about the steering committee and the work that you're due, before you see how we've outlined the course of work over the next meetings, the series of 5 meetings. And so we're going to give you a deep dive in all of this work, priority networks, funding options, funding strategy, and conclude with presenting that recommendation to the executive committee. And we're going to provide you with information every step of the way. And most importantly, answer your questions and get your insights as we work together to move the region forward. And so with that, I know we walked through a lot.
You get that foot stuff I left you? Yeah, thank you.
Put your phones on mute. That would be wonderful. I can do that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rory McGinnis, who is Deputy Director of Public Service. He'll walk you through the mobility report. Rory?
Thanks, Gail. And I'm honored to join the Lincus team and excited to be working with all of you. Next slide. This June, the Lincus partners published the State of Mobility Report. It provides a snapshot of current demographic trends and existing conditions in our transportation system. It establishes the why for mobility investments, identifies existing and emerging mobility needs, and showcases the elements that are most important to understanding mobility in our region. The report also highlights key statistics relevant to multiple modes of transportation in Columbus and Franklin County. It documents our current needs, as well as the critical opportunity we have at this moment to respond to those needs. Next slide. I believe this slide is the most important to understanding our current state of mobility, the challenges we face as a region, and why LinkUS is so important. Our region has grown significantly in population and geography over the last 70 years, both at the Columbus and suburban city levels. This was due to Columbus making strategic investments in water and sewer infrastructure to drive annexation, providing utility services to surrounding cities, federal housing policies, highway construction, a strong and diverse economy, and outmigration of middle-income, predominantly white residents in response to school desegregation and the use of busing. Similar to other communities across the country, there was a history of racially discriminatory housing policies in our region beginning in the early 20th century. Racially restrictive covenants became a popular tactic to create and maintain white majority neighborhoods. Nearly 2/3 of subdivisions that were platted in Central Ohio had restrictive covenants placed on them that prohibited the sale of homes to Black residents. Many of you are well aware of the history of redlining, both nationally and locally, in which residential security maps like the one here for Columbus were created to rank areas based on a biased view of desirability versus risk for mortgages. African-American and immigrant communities were typically classified as red and thus redlined. This limited opportunities for home ownership and had devastating impacts to upward mobility. The creation of the interstate highway system further sped the suburbanization of the region in the 1950s and 60s. Since historically Black neighborhoods such as the King Lincoln District had been redlined, highways like 70, 71, and 670 were built right through them. This further contributed to these neighborhoods' declining standard of living and ability to attract investment. Additionally, the resulting low density and unwalkable development patterns made other mobility options like transit far less accessible to these neighborhoods. Next slide. This slide shows just how devastating these impacts have been. The redlined areas that we shared in the previous slide is nearly identical to the current opportunity index map on this slide. The areas of lowest opportunity are primarily low-income minority communities, and our most socially vulnerable areas correlate strongly with areas of low opportunity. In addition, socially vulnerable communities are more likely to have individuals living with chronic diseases. Next slide. In this slide, you see essentially the opposite of the previous slide, where there's a strong correlation between the areas of opportunity and job density. Franklin County supports many jobs. In addition to the over 471,000 people that live and work within the county, about 302,000 people commute into the county every day to work. This is compared to the around 155,000 people that live within the county but work elsewhere. In addition, as the number of jobs continue to increase in the county, workers will require more affordable and safe options to get them to work. Reliance on single occupancy vehicle travel will not support continued growth of the city and county's diverse economy. Next slide. Currently, high-frequency transit is largely only concentrated along the densest corridors in the city. Almost 94% of riders access transit via walking, and the majority of riders are from minority and/or low-income populations. Areas of low opportunity are less likely to have access to low-stress bike facilities. Low-income neighborhoods have access to 28% less park space than high-income neighborhoods. Prioritizing sidewalk gaps, especially around transit facilities, is critical to improving our first and last mile connections. 65% of all serious crashes occur on just 10% of our city streets. There's a 46% increase in traffic deaths since 2015, and 297 miles of roadway are located on the regional high injury network. To address these safety concerns, our department has put forward the Vision Zero effort that aims to reduce traffic fatalities to zero by 2035. Over 80% of residents in the county commute alone daily. That's 4% higher than the national average. Our most vulnerable communities are also the most cost burdened in both housing and transportation. As growth pressures continue, we will need a comprehensive mobility investment strategy that expands our transportation choices. Many of you have likely seen the recent census numbers, which confirm what we've all been experiencing. Columbus and all of Central Ohio is growing rapidly. The question for us now is, how will we grow? As we prioritize our infrastructure investments to guide and manage our growth, it's critical that we do so intentionally, learning from our past mistakes, ensuring we are advancing opportunity for everyone, and avoiding outcomes that exacerbate disparity rather than ameliorate it. Continuing the legacy of the Longstreet Bridge, we will use Lincus to foster equitable growth in infrastructure investment, restoring connections, building ladders of opportunity, and transforming our region. These are just a few of the key takeaways from the State of Mobility report. It's really important for you to review the report if you haven't had a chance to do so yet. And you can reach that, as well as lots of other resources for Lincus, at lincuscolumbus.com/resources. Through this report and the previous work that has been done by our partners, you're now going to hear from the rest of my colleagues about what actions we are taking to transform our region through Lincus, and how the steering committee will help us to define the specific outcomes we want to achieve, develop funding options, and adopt a playbook to move Lincus into reality. Next, Jennifer Walton, Director of Marketing for CODA, will provide you insight on the momentum that we see for transformational mobility. Thanks.
And thank you, Rory. Thank you all for allowing me to join and share on behalf of the great work that we're doing here at CODA and together. I get really passionate about what's to come with this initiative, and hopefully you are too. CODA fields a community sentiment survey twice a year. In our most recent community sentiment survey from Q2 of this year, we collaborated to include several questions related to the Lincus initiative. From that, we believe we have a few key areas of momentum working with us. I'll dive a bit deeper into each, but high level. When we look at the survey results, we see lots of positive signs indicating support for advancing a larger mobility initiative. Our community also sees a strong relationship between transit, future growth, and equitable opportunities. So the takeaway is that it remains very important that we share the journey of this work, and that we let the community see us doing this work of reimagining mobility in this region together. And lastly, alignment with the federal administration. At this point, the US infrastructure bill will inject billions of dollars into transportation infrastructure. Next slide, please. So our initial results indicates community support for the expansion of public transportation. Something to note is that this is even amongst those who do not currently utilize the CODA service. So you can see here, 76% of residents agree that access to public transportation is important. Again, even if they do not personally use it themselves. We see that 46% agree that they wish they didn't have to drive as much. This could point to a possible, though currently untapped base of residents that are yearning for new transit options. And we do extensive segmentation, so we keep our eyes on that. 65% of residents think that expanding and improving public transit should be a regional priority for us. Similarly, 63% support building high frequency bus rapid transit lines with younger residents, women residents, residents of the city of Columbus, and those that are in households that have an annual income of less than $100,000, indicating higher levels of support. And when you think more broadly than just transportation, we see through our research that Central Ohio residents maintain a positive sentiment towards the growth and planning opportunities in our region. 79% of residents support building walkable communities where residents can walk to their retail, local restaurants, schools, jobs, and parks. Going back to the previous data point on, I wish I didn't have to drive as much. 78% support ensuring that all new development includes bike lanes and sidewalks, multimodal support. And then 73% of our residents that we surveyed support ensuring that new development is connected to public transit. So they see how it all comes together. Gail mentioned this in her comments earlier, but we really must do this together. Community support for this work shows that public and private entities must come together and align our talent and our resources towards a shared high priority vision to do the following. We need to come together to increase mobility options, expanding and innovating our regional transit network. We're talking about the corridors, high capacity, high frequent, rapid transit. Working together to create thriving, sustainable communities, built with equity and prosperity as key outcomes. We've talked about our priorities and how it always comes back to those words. Providing enhanced opportunities, better access to new housing, job opportunities, and then of course, increasing equitable access to economic and social prosperity, thinking about this work through the lens of dignity. And lastly, when it comes to the federal administration, we are aligned. What's important to note is that federal funding for projects, infrastructure projects like LinkUS, is going to be closely tied to how well our efforts align with addressing inequities in our proposed investments. Gail shared our priorities in her comments earlier around and exactly how we will do that. Regional prioritization of LinkUS will allow us to leverage those federal resources. The new federal transit funding criteria shows an increased focus on affordable housing and projects to serve our underserved communities. That's right in line with our shared vision that even Rory just walked through for us today. That funding will help us correct the imbalance of transportation and infrastructure inequities, progressing our region through all of these key priorities that we're talking through today. But we know that this alignment is strong because our foundation, the community support for transit growth is strong as well. And so I mentioned that we field this survey twice a year, and so we look forward to doing this again in Q4 of this year and continuing to measure that support. With that momentum, I'll pass it over to Stephen to discuss our peer cities review. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. You guys are getting hit with a lot of information. I hope that you're not overwhelmed, and I don't want to contribute to the confusion, but hopefully add a little bit of comfort in that what you're going to hear from me next is there's a lot of folks that have been through very similar circumstances as the Columbus and Central Ohio region is beginning to face. And it wouldn't be a good planning process if we didn't make the effort to do a little bit of research and to figure out what it is that we can learn from others. And admittedly, there's no perfect analog when we think about what's a great comparison community, but we can do a little bit of investigating and determine what might be relevant from those places. We've already heard today that Columbus is one of the fastest growing places. You guys already know that. But what is impressive is that you're now in an elite group of cities around the US that is not only growing fast, but you're incredibly large in scale. This isn't the place of 10 years ago. I grew up in Central Ohio, and I'm hearkening back to what it was 20 and 30 years ago. And to William Murdoch's point, I can only imagine what this place will be 10 and 20 years from now. We've got an opportunity to shape that. One of the things, though, that we have in common amongst all of these communities is that we're facing some shared experiences, and some of them aren't so pleasant. A few of the things that come to mind is an affordability crisis. The bottom line is that all things cost more, but they're incredibly profound in their impact on household incomes. Housing is at the top of everyone's list right now. Among the other things that we're concerned about is really just some of the things that we're witnessing right now more than ever, which is a lack of shared prosperity. That's kind of code language for saying that some have more than others, and the upward mobility isn't happening across the board. We're also seeing some cultural shifts because the people who live here today exhibit some different demographics than maybe what were here yesterday and years past. And the result of all this growth tends to exacerbate some of the things that we have been experiencing, but in more marginal ways. Simply stated, we're having a lot more inefficiencies, and that's largely a direct result of our growth patterns. You've had several studies in the region that have documented this, so it's not a surprise to us. And then lastly, I think the other thing that all of these places have in common is there is incredible pressure to maintain your competitive advantage. Simply stated, you all want to leave this place to the next generation in better shape than you found it. You want better opportunities. So when we think about Columbus, and I look at this peer city spectrum, some of the things at the forefront of my mind is when you start diving into the data, only 5.5% of people regularly commute by walking, biking, or riding transit. Only 5.5%. That means everyone else is either driving or telecommuting. We know that most of those folks are driving. 80% or more are driving single occupant vehicles alone daily to work. Now, the pandemic certainly has had an impact. None of us can crystal ball exactly what the outcome will be in a post-pandemic world, but we know that we were already experiencing those pressures before the pandemic. And when we add the increment of growth, we can only expect that those pressures are going to continue to exacerbate. So it's important for us to kind of contemplate that. The other thing that's on my mind is that over 38,000 households in Franklin County don't have access to a car. So if our infrastructure is built primarily around moving people through auto means, and we're moving farther away from goods and services, then we've got a recipe for something that's not so pleasant in the way of a future. And so now is a great time for us to reflect on all the things we've learned up to this point, to operationalize them, to stand behind them, and to act. Let's take a look at the next slide. So I've been really fortunate to work around the country in communities very similar in size to Central Ohio, coast to coast, really. And many of the places I just mentioned, we've done plans for it. But I think all of them would admit to you that there's no silver bullet. There isn't any one thing that you can do that makes all these externalities disappear. The reality is that these places, just like Columbus and Central Ohio, are growing and evolving, quite frankly. And we're a different community with different needs. Those needs are changing and they're increasing. And so a lot of places, while they're dusting off their plans, some are even developing new plans, but they're not relying solely on just the idea of visioning. You've already done your visioning. You know what the solution set is. The question is how do we get to it? I think the other thing that each of those communities would acknowledge is that the plans are great at setting expectations and describing a better future, but really decision-making is made against public policy. And unless we're willing to pick up the public policy that largely was here 20 years ago, dust it off and decide what is supportive of the desired outcomes we want and what's not supportive, and be willing to change them, we probably are going to be starting from a place of deficit. The other thing that these communities would all admit to you is that there's not enough time or resources to do everything well on your own. That there is an inherent need today, when compared to other times in history, to amplify our efforts through enhanced coordination. We often talk about this in terms of just simply saying we need internal alignment. It doesn't mean that there aren't good people doing good work out there in very specific ways, whether that's on housing or transportation or equity, but it does mean that we need to find ways to bring our requisite skills to the table and learn how to amplify our coordinated efforts so that the needle moves more quickly. And I think at the end of the day, this is about accelerating our progress. It's not that we're not doing good things. It's about finding ways to make the needle move much quicker and try to get in front of some of these challenges before, quite frankly, they get out of control. I think lastly, the final thing that almost all of them will admit is that they're all doing good things. The problem is they can't do enough good things at once to keep up with the growing needs of the region. And the needs aren't the same as what they were a decade ago. So on top of things, we're having to learn quickly on how to adapt to the changing needs and keep up with maintaining a system that was largely built around a singular approach to mobility. Let's take a look at the next slide. So I don't have time to maybe invest in a full detailed diagnostic of what all these places are doing. But what I can share with you is a little bit of detail about the 4 that are listed up here. And I'm going to talk even more detail about Charlotte and Austin in a moment. But Charlotte is another great example of a place that has gone through some growing pains, to put it quite frankly. And I live in Charlotte, so I'm intimately familiar with what's happening in Charlotte. And I was really fortunate to be asked by Mayor Vi to help facilitate a very similar group to what you all represent. It was a mobility task force that essentially said, look, we've got to get in front of these things. And we've got a history in Charlotte of making one-time historic investments when we need to migrate from one thing to another. Over 20 years ago, we made a similar investment to build our first light rail and streetcar system, but it wasn't really a system, it was a single line. And it now comes to 2021, where we're recognizing that that system we've already outgrown. And we've got great plans, but we need to figure out ways to implement them. And quite frankly, we're just not well positioned to do so without a change of circumstance. Indianapolis, I think a lot of you have some intimate familiarity. You've probably traveled to Indianapolis. You recognize the place that Indy was 20 years ago and see where it's headed today. And most notably in the headlines, you'll see that in 2016, they passed a referendum. And you probably have read a lot, or maybe had an opportunity to experience their new bus rapid transit system they refer to as Red Line. It opened in 2019. That's transformational. That's not the Indianapolis of 20 years ago. They're being very intentional about aligning their investments with places where the greatest needs exist and the greatest opportunities to do economic development. I would point out something here as well. It looks like they did that all in 3 years, but they didn't, right? There was work that preceded 2016 that better positioned them for success. I would point out that Central Ohio has done that same amount of work. You've put the time in. You've heard a little bit about the East-West, the Northwest corridor. You know about Insight 2050. You know the good work that MORPSI's been doing. All of this is in preparation for this moment in time. That brings me to Austin, and I'm going to talk more in detail about it, but I think most of you come into it with at least hearing people talk about Austin. Keep it weird, right? It's a great place. It's the place with which Silicon Valley is relocating to. Austin is experiencing extreme growth pressures. And for all the great things that Austin is, if you talk to residents, they will tell you they have the worst traffic they've ever experienced. They're concerned about their future. And Mayor Adler would tell you, when faced with these growing trends of concern, look, if we want to see something different, we want different outcomes, we're going to have to do something different. And that became a rallying cry. And as a result, their local voters decided that they were going to support a $7 billion historic investment in transportation. That happened just this past year. I think we're all looking with eyes of envy right now, but also eyes to learn what's working there. And quite frankly, some of the things that they're having challenges with as well. Now, Minneapolis to the north, my goodness, there's so many things going on in Minneapolis, it's hard to keep track of. For those of you who are kind of policy wonks, you know that they've got one of the most progressive, comprehensive plans and unified development ordinances out there. And that's a recent change. but they also have so many transportation investments going on, it's hard to keep track. Just at this moment in time, they're working on 75 additional miles of bike and trail infrastructure. 75 miles is huge, by the way. It is transformational. It is truly permeating throughout the city in ways that create new choices that people would never have thought of 20 years ago. They also have an additional extension to their light rail project system, and they're investing in bus rapid transit for the first time. These things don't happen by accident. They just were named the most bike-friendly city in the country, despite how cold it is during January, February, and March. These are impressive things. Let's move on and take a look at the next. So I promised you I'd mention a little bit more about Charlotte, and specifically Charlotte Moves. And I referenced Mayor Vi Lyles, who's been kind of a cornerstone of putting this issue in front of the community so that we don't pass it on to the next generation. And it really began with an acknowledgement that we've got some pretty good plans in Charlotte. We really do. And it's not so much that we need yet another plan to tell us what we should be doing, as much as we needed to reflect on the observation, which is it's going to take us over 50 years to implement these plans under current funding levels. 50 years was profound for people to hear. They're used to hearing about how great the plan is, how great the strategy is, but no one had ever spoken to the community in such plain language to suggest we're going to be here a long time before things get better, folks. And in the meantime, we've got hundreds of thousands of people that are moving here. And we're already experiencing externalities. And so folks had to ask the question, is it appropriate for us to wait, or is it better to make an investment? And in fact, the language has even been transformed. People are now beginning to remind themselves about the word investment means. It's not spending something to enjoy it today. It's about putting money into something so we enjoy the benefits tomorrow. And in the absence of making investments, Charlotte is faced with the acknowledgement that their income gap, their upward mobility gap, their travel gap is going to continue to grow. And so, similar to the efforts that you're going to be undertaking, Charlotte underwent a similar process. It's been 5 months studying this detail by detail, figuring out their why, the what, but most importantly, the how that you were referenced with earlier today. This particular effort has culminated in the acknowledgement that they're likely to go to the voters in 2022 with a funding referendum. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. It's essentially probably going to be somewhere in the scale of around $6 to $7 billion of local investment. This is modeled a lot after what they're learning from Austin. So everyone's learning from each other. So really fortunate to work on a plan for Austin that preceded this effort, really a series of plans. But prior to all of that, the reference to North Star was made by Gail earlier. Austin kind of set the tone for planning against the North Star. They adopted Imagine Austin, which became a universal way where everyone was going to agree how we accommodate our future growth. And Austin was thinking about not just the next 100,000 people, they're thinking about the next 1 million people. They know that this growth isn't going to end. And I would argue Central Ohio's is not going to end. And so by looking big, looking far, they were able to capture the attention of the community in a way that hadn't been in the past. They had some failed efforts when they looked at things through singular lenses. They had failed bond referendums. They had failed housing programs. But when they started facing the community with profound questions like, well, if we're going to grow up an additional 1 million people, how would you prefer that increment of growth travel throughout the community? It's a tough question. But the voters in Austin clearly understood that they'd much rather that the increment of growth that occurs in their community be accommodated in a more effective way, a more efficient way, a way that would pay dividends and address a multitude of circumstances. They also knew that they weren't going to be able to be successful with their ask of the voters unless they diversified the ask. It needed to resonate with everyone, not just some people who might enjoy riding transit. And so they began to look at it through the lens of what can we do to advance the initiatives in our region that are of greatest value and importance to everyone. They coupled these things together in 2 propositions. Proposition A, which was largely focused around the transit initiative and Proposition B, which is essentially connecting and leveraging the transit investment. That outcome of coordination is what we're all seeking right now, finding ways with which to bring enhanced alignment amongst the initiatives. Next slide. So Austin also was part of a big wave. So the folks at APTA, Center for Transportation Excellence, they track all this information for us, and annually they denote how many ballot measures occur each year. And it just so happens that this past year was a big year, almost unprecedented in scale. There were 53 measures, 47 of them passed. And you can see the trends down at the bottom. We're actually trending upward in terms of folks supporting these types of initiatives. But I'm kind of a data nerd, and I'll tell you that if you mine through this data, you have to really begin to understand that there's granularity in where there's support and why the support was successful. And places with populations the scale of Central Ohio and larger, largely were successful by diversifying. They weren't single issue ballot measures. They weren't just to advance transit. They were to connect transit in a more effective way and add more capacity, add a full system. And I think that's an important annotation for us to consider in Central Ohio as we continue our conversations together. But the next slide, just as Jennifer pointed out, the timing couldn't be better, right? We know that there's an unprecedented federal investment in infrastructure that's about to happen. And these other places that I just mentioned, as well as a host of dozens of others of cities, are preparing themselves to be competitive in that process. The advantage that Columbus has is that you've done all the hard work up front. You've done the planning, you've done the visioning, you know the strategy. The problem that we run into right now is that we've got to determine the answer to the how. And if we can do that collectively together, there's no reason why Central Ohio can't be well positioned to get not just our fair share, but to make a profound investment in the region so that we can prepare ourselves for the future and ensure that we're leaving the region in a much more competitive circumstance than what we even find ourselves today. And with that, I'll turn things over to Kim Sharp.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that was a great storyboard to understand why now it's really vital that we align our efforts for such a large vision as Lincus. Next slide. There are multiple critical initiatives going on concurrently in our region right now, such as Franklin County's Rise Together Blueprint with efforts to reduce poverty, the City of Columbus's Climate Action Plan and the zoning code update efforts, Central Ohio Greenways Plan, connecting our region with bike trails, and the recent ULI Columbus and MORPC-led Rapid 5 efforts. And what do all these types of efforts have in common? They're all towards desired outcomes of focused growth, access to quality jobs and housing, public health, equity, and connecting it all with transportation choices. Quite simply, it would behoove us to have transportation choices that makes it easy to choose to not drive alone in your car, but opens up job opportunities, housing opportunities for families that makes a better quality of life. LinkUS is central to these, running collective thoughts and collective efforts to rise everyone up and to give people opportunities in these transportation choices. Next slide. I want to point out a document that is online. We worked on this last year, the framework strategy. It was developed as a means of pulling the previous planning efforts together, as well as what we're learning from our peer cities. The focus of this is implementation. These efforts really pulled CODA, the City of Columbus, Franklin County, and MORPC together in a way that needed to align policies, future planning, and budgeting efforts. With that, I want to point out some ingredients for success that's in this document. Number one, unifying the effort. This past year included a healthy analysis of applicable planning documents and tying these previous efforts into one implementation strategy. We created the identity of LinkUS, moving our region together. building a system. This is not one or two corridors. The LinkUS system is about a high capacity transit system. The sidewalks, trails, bike paths, and development patterns that propel the Central Ohio's growth to these corridors. Part of this committee's charge is to help clearly define the components of that system that will move the needle the most in our community. Identify dedicated funding. MORPC's Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or the MTP, is the document ODOT and the federal government look to that identifies future projects that may be eligible for state and federal funding. The most recently adopted MTP has identified a number of these corridors, along with trails, sidewalks, et cetera, utilizing very preliminary estimates to include them. Our most recent efforts on the Northwest Corridor and the East-West Corridor, which we'll talk about in a moment, give clarity to those estimates. But one thing is really clear to all of us. The LinkUS effort is a large infrastructure investment for our region, for our region's future. Part of the charge of this group is to help identify what local, state, and federal funding mechanisms would support such a holistic investment. A local funding mechanism is required by the federal grant program utilized by other communities for such an endeavor. This is part of your work. Partnerships. We're only going to be able to do this together. Public, private, nonprofit, and institutions. Regional support. To have a successful funding strategy, to have buy-in for the mobility options and the development patterns that make the most sense, this needs to be something the multiple communities and the general public understand. They understand the why, and they support it for our future. And then engagement. LinkUS wants to be an investment that knits our neighborhoods together. Therefore, it is about the neighborhoods and the people. We need you to help us bring some final definition and choices of the key elements of this program, of the priority networks. We need to position ourselves to go build something. The next slide. What makes high capacity transit different than anything we've had in Central Ohio before? We're going to talk about that as we get in transition into the two corridors currently under preliminary engineering efforts. And this is where I pass it off to Justin. Thank you.
I'll actually be jumping in, Zach. I'll turn it over to Justin after this. So we have really accomplished an incredible amount of work over the past 18 months, completing the first phase of pre-planning work for the Northwest Corridor and the East-West Corridor. Each of these corridors have been identified for transformative investment as part of a premium bus rapid transit network. CODA is about to move forward by submitting the West Broad Street and East Main Street corridors into the federal funding process and design. The Northwest Corridor is moving into its next phase of design and plan for entry into the federal funding process as early as next year. East Broad Street has been adopted as a locally preferred alternative and will begin its next step at the appropriate time, which will be more refined in the work within the next couple of months. And this is really about creating a system. The graphic on the next slide represents some of the steps that have been completed so far for each of these corridor projects. It's really about how we are working through detailed processes required by the Federal Transit Administration in order for federal funding purposes. Many of you have participated in our various stakeholder engagement and public input sessions so far. And I just want to reiterate that there's a lot more details on our website at linkuscolumbus.com that you can look at on your own outside of this meeting. So both corridor projects, like I said, have had several stakeholder engagement opportunities and public input earlier this year. And we have really heard similar input from both of these corridor processes. The overarching themes are a desire for more travel choices and safety enhancements, importance of quality, walkable places, wish to see less auto-centric development patterns that better integrate with surrounding neighborhoods, and a desire for sustainable transportation modes, including more permanent transit infrastructure. So here are some of the features that we are looking into for the Lincus corridors. I want to iterate that this is something that we don't have in our Central Ohio region today. And it's similar to what some of our peer cities that Stephen mentioned earlier, that they have also rolled out and are planning to roll out in the future. The basis of these elements are elements to speed up transit travel times and make transit a more viable option to move around in our region. The two I want to point out here are dedicated right-of-way and enhanced stations. Contrary to what we have today, transit vehicles, dedicated right-of-way would allow transit vehicles to operate in designated lanes to speed up travel times and for improved reliability. Then for enhanced stations, instead of a bus stop sign and sometimes a shelter or bench, creating a station-like waiting environment that could include level boarding and work with the surrounding area. On the next slide, these graphics represent how bus rapid transit could look like within our streets, particularly for the Northwest and East-West corridors. Justin, if you go back one more, I just want to note a couple of things on these slides. So the dedicated travel lanes for transit, enhanced stations, you have the safe walkable pedestrian environment, coordination with other non-automobile travel like bike share and multi-use paths, and then also the transit supportive design patterns, which Justin will touch on the next slide.
Thanks, Zach. So as Zach covered in some of those images, those graphics really highlight the level of integration between transit and mobility infrastructure investment and the outcomes of quality of place and coordination with sidewalk access and bicycle access and coordination with surrounding development as well. We know that high capacity transit is only really successful when it's coupled with compact transit-oriented development patterns. And to that end, the Lincus work to date has established a series of transit-supported development principles. These are documented in our recent Northwest Corridor Phase 1 mobility study report that's available on the website as well. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We really leverage the Northwest Corridor effort to lay some groundwork that informs all of the corridor efforts, as well as the East-West Corridor and future corridors as well. This really is about aligning our development policies and our design in both the private development realm and the public realm as well. So emphasizing a compact, walkable development pattern that also provides a range of housing options, particularly at transit station areas and along these corridors. And integration of quality open spaces, providing safe, convenient connections to existing parks and greenways. And that's something that we've heard over and over again as part of our engagement. While there's a lot of interest in advancing high capacity rapid transit, there's just as much interest in providing these active transportation connections, whether it's to transit or to the open space system, leveraging ideas that we've recently seen emerge through Rapid 5 to bring that holistic quality of life approach to these infrastructure investments. And emphasizing the interface between private development sites and the public street. You know, these things all need to fit together in a cohesive way to really bring these outcomes that we seek in transforming places and making them more productive for the people that live and work here. And finally, creation of integrated mobility networks that tie together and really provide people with a feasible option for reducing their reliance on the car and being able to use transit or walk or bike or use some sort of micro mobility service, really having those real options so that people have choice. And how does this all come together? Ultimately, this is about transforming place. You see an image here of Olentangy River Road today. While each corridor is going to look different in response to its existing neighborhood characteristics, this image captures the design intent that we have of creating a 21st century mobility corridor, tying together these infrastructure investments that we haven't seen in the region to date, along with our policies around development patterns and expectations of the private sector in creating these new types of places and places for opportunity along these corridors. So as Zach noted, we've built incredible momentum, laying the groundwork for an interconnected system of high capacity transit corridors. Significant resources have been committed already by the Lincus partners to study the first phases of the Northwest corridor, the East-West corridor, and now moving into specific design projects for 3 BRT projects. So this is getting real. We're preparing to enter 2 projects into the FTA grant funding process, and with a third that we're targeting within the year. So we're really at a point where we need to capitalize on this momentum. At this time, though, we don't have a clear, complete funding strategy identified to build, operate, and maintain these or other future corridor projects. We know that these transit investments as well, for them to really succeed, they must be coupled with complementary investments in the connecting infrastructure, in the streetscapes, the sidewalks, the bikeways, as well as that transit supported development pattern. So these corridor projects are major undertakings. They take many years to complete on even an aggressive schedule. Implementing a single BRT corridor project can take at least 6 years from planning and design. You know, where we're at now, we're finishing up first phases of planning and identifying feasible alternatives. We're moving into design processes on 3 corridors right now. And ultimately, you know, we want to get to the point where we have successful projects that have received federal funding and are proceeding through construction and ultimately operation. We're likely in a position where we can have 3 premium BRT lines constructed and operating by the end of this decade. But we know that there's a point along the way for each of these where we have to demonstrate the clear local funding commitment that we bring to the table as a local match as we pursue federal funding. And so really the time is now for us to set the pace and ensure the pace of momentum as we're advancing these projects through very technical processes. Part of that technical analysis with the Federal Transit Administration is the local community bringing to bear the resources that will leverage those federal dollars. So that brings us to the task at hand for the steering committee. You know, as we move forward with the technical steps required to best position each transit corridor for federal funding, we know that we need to be looking at the bigger picture. This is about much more than implementing just a few BRT lines. It's about implementing a system, a high capacity rapid transit system that's going to have transformational impact for the city and the region, as well as a larger mobility system. And that really brings us back to why we've convened this group of all of you to help us shape this program. And harking back to some points that Gail made at the top of this meeting, we're looking to create a coordinated mobility infrastructure program and investment strategy, aligning civic and community leadership represented by the group that we have in this virtual meeting here today, to provide a path forward that will ensure success. And so that brings us back to answering that how question that we've talked about here. Identifying this sustainable funding strategy. And to get to the how, we are identifying that what. So answering the what of a mobility infrastructure program really is about how we address our community needs. And again, many of those are outlined in the State of Mobility report that Rory covered earlier, as well as those foundational studies in Insight 2050 and Next Gen in corridor concepts. And these many other aligned initiatives that Kim covered a few slides ago. Really, how do we improve the quality of life for the residents in our community in tangible ways through strategic and prioritized infrastructure investments? How do we solve some of the issues that we see on a slide like this, whether it's around our safety needs, our equitable access needs to jobs or open space, or even thinking about sort of non-traditional infrastructure that we see emerging in the federal infrastructure bill as well, going beyond just transportation infrastructure, but thinking about how Access to information through broadband can be leveraged to improve quality of life as we're making these strategic investments. So currently, our team members are working through a technical review of our existing transportation plans to identify what we might consider to be what we call priority mobility networks. We're borrowing a page from the Charlotte model and the Austin model here, this comprehensive approach to our integrated mobility systems. There's been a lot of great planning work done already. We've noted that a number of times throughout this presentation. So we're benefiting from past efforts. And importantly, we're not starting from scratch, but we also know we need to prioritize those improvements that will have the greatest impact on the community to achieve our goals. There's no shortage of great ideas for improvements to the transportation system, highlighted on some of the maps you see here. And many of them are documented in MORPC's Metropolitan Transportation Plan in particular. There's a lot of need that's documented. What there's a shortage of is funding. And that's what we're here to determine. What are the highest priorities and how are we going to fund them? So as we've seen from our other peer cities, as Stephen Sansbury noted, many are taking the approach of a more comprehensive mobility program to guide their strategic investments. We, of course, see transit, specifically high capacity rapid transit, as the core element of a program for Columbus and Franklin County in Central Ohio. But for transit to be successful, as I noted earlier, we need to link that with a robust multimodal system. That means we need to connect people to the transit system through our greenways, through our bikeways, through our sidewalk system, filling the gaps that we have in our system today, and tying these networks together. How do they tie together in new opportunities to create mobility hubs around transit station areas, coordinated with that new transit supportive development pattern, where we're providing more jobs and housing opportunities. Thinking about the infrastructure needs around utilities to accommodate the growth that we're really managing as part of this strategy. And thinking about the impacts on housing needs that we've already touched on throughout this presentation. As Stephen noted, many communities are grappling with growing housing needs, housing affordability issues, transportation affordability issues. So we want to take this comprehensive, holistic view of how we think about developing a program that makes sense for Columbus and Central Ohio. So we want to ask you to keep these different buckets of potential funding elements in mind as we move into discussion here and as we think about what makes sense for our region as we develop a program and prioritize these mobility networks and these potential investments that we want to advance. But we'll ask you to zoom out as well and encourage you to keep the big picture in mind. Ultimately, we're talking about desired outcomes. What does the city in Central Ohio look like when we successfully implement a program like this? And please let that sort of drive your thinking about how we develop a program, identify priorities, and come to a consensus around a strategy to implement it. And with that, I'm going to hand this back to Gail to facilitate discussion.
Thank you so much, Justin. And I'm going to ask that we stop sharing the screen so we can see the faces of our steering committee members. And if they can join us back with your cameras as we begin our discussion. Wow, I know that was a lot of information, but we felt it very important to give you a backdrop of the significant work that we have to accomplish together. And so we have this is your time. We know that many of you may have some questions or some thoughts or some insights as you've listened to our presentation and gathered information for all the work that's happening in our peer cities and the work that we've done before. We want to hear from you. And so thank you so much for returning to your cameras. And if you have a question, you can either raise your hand in real time or you can use the feature in the Zoom to raise your hand. But I know some people have been sending me love notes in the chat, so I'm going to start there. And I really do thank you for being so engaged. One of the questions that has come up, Stephen, you talked about Austin, and Justin kind of went through some potential program elements. But when you talk about diversifying and adding a full system, what does that look like, Stephen? And can you talk a little bit more about Austin and bring that to what that means for us and how this steering committee can think about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the reality is that we recognize that sometimes we get dominated by the pieces of any initiative. In this case, transportation oftentimes gravitates to solutions that are most efficient. That's transit. You know, you can move more people by transit than any other means more efficiently than anything else that we have to offer. The problem is that transit has to be in very specific places in order to be successful. Justin alluded to the fact that we have to create transit supportive environments. You can't just build a line. I'll give you the example that Dallas, Texas, for example, has the second largest passenger rail system in the country, but they have some of the lowest ridership, right? They didn't create the environment where people are drawn to, attracted to, and can connect with the system. And so we know that whenever we endeavor to make these kinds of investments, we need to be sure that they're as successful as they can be. If we don't connect the system with where people are and where they need to be, that's number one. And number two, if we don't create access points along the routes for that, then we've somewhat failed. And three, we've got to demonstrate why someone who maybe is wed to their car should lend their support to making an expensive investment in something other than how they choose to travel. And that's really the hardest part of all of this. I think when you break things down, it's a fairly logical assertion that anything in life largely benefits from a diversified portfolio, whether it's your retirement fund or whether it's your transportation system. We don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. It makes us too vulnerable. And so in places like Austin and Charlotte, they know that they need to broaden the appeal, build a broad coalition of support, not just simply by adding more things, but showcasing the shared benefit. Every person in the future that moves here, that moves around our region by walking, biking, or riding transit is one less person driving in a car. And so if we can relate to the suburban driver, for example, that maybe doesn't have direct access to high capacity transit in the future, maybe doesn't have a shared experience growing up with that or using that kind of service, we want to showcase the shared benefit that can result from making an integrated investment choice in our transportation system. And when we do it well, and we trust the planners to really do the due diligence about where and what, we'll find that that kind of investment has the potential to serve us for decades to come. I mean, you only have to look at mature cities, the largest of our metros in the US, to see how successful those investments are. It doesn't mean they don't have congestion, right? I think that that's the one cautionary tale that I would offer to all of you, is that this isn't something that will take away travel delay, but will create opportunities for increased connectivity, reduced reliance on our roadway systems, create economic development opportunities so that more jobs are concentrated in places that are most accessible, and offers us a way to accommodate that increment of growth. Whether some want it or not, we all agree, we know it's going to come, that we can provide a mechanism with which to absorb that growth. Simply stated, we talk in terms of carrying capacity. How much can our existing transportation system support? Some would tell you we can't support anymore. The reality is that we would love to be able to accommodate more. We need to accommodate more in a growing economy. And the only way we do so is by diversifying and increasing our carrying capacity.
Super. Thank you so much, Stephen, for answering that question. I know we have quite a few hands up, so thank you so much. Yarmir, we're going to start with you. I know you chaired a few of those committees previously, and so thank you for being here. You have a question or a comment?
I would like to make a comment, Gail. First, I want to thank you for organizing this meeting so effectively and running it so effectively. And thank you for all the presenters putting everything in perspective. I will take a few minutes to summarize and then maybe ask a question. I mean, in summary, what I would like for those of us who have not been part of the prior studies, and Stephen, that's for you as well, you know, we did not arrive to mobility starting at mobility. We started at the 1 million people arriving to Columbus in the next 40 years. And then when we look at the 1 million people, the question was, where do we put them? And then we realized that denser models work better. And that was inside 2050. Then the idea was, where do we put that density? Then, wow, transit corridors or mobility corridors, like we call them, are a good place to put them. So then we said, wow, maybe then we need to focus on mobility if we are to densify our community with all the benefits it brings, equity, sustainability, etc. So, I mean, I want to put mobility in the context of the densification of our urban fabric. I mean, that's where we started. And then I want really to support, I mean, something you said, Stephen, about Dallas. That's exactly what we don't want to do. So, so this is why our focus should not be only on mobility, but all the other things go with it. It's very difficult. There's lots of mobility expertise here, and I'm afraid that we're going to forget some of those things. If you, for example, we want to create job access to jobs along those transit corridors, we need to have broadband in those corridors in huge amounts, because that is what drives the business. If you want affordability of housing, then you need to work with the municipalities where those corridors are, so we have the right kind of housing policies, affordable housing requirements. They have to have some tax benefits. What are the tax benefits we are going to give, TIF or otherwise, to the people who develop along those corridors? So in return, they provide the affordable housing component we want. And how do we, I mean, I think I agree with many things that Justin said. It's very important that the zoning changes, the entitlement process is changed. I mean, you know, if we have the antiquated entitlement process we have in the city of Columbus today and all the other municipalities, which is really 40, 50 years old, it is not adapted to the transit corridor. So we'll build the corridor and nothing will be happen on it, because like on High Street, right side is one neighborhood commission, left side is another neighborhood commission. They have different opinions about what to do, and the city doesn't, you know, override. So, I mean, all I want to make, I mean, actually those things do not require lots of money, like building the corridors, the mobility, etc. But it requires that we focus on them. That is, as we study this, we need to worry about entitlement process, form-based codes, about broadbands, about tax incentive, affordable housing requirements, because we are about to build an incredible tool. And this is where, and I'm competing now with Austin and Charlotte, because these were the two cities we looked at. You know, Charlotte did a good job integrating all mobility components. I think Columbus has to do one more, integrating all the equity components, all the housing components, all the broadband components, all the you know, entitlement pieces. That is, that to look at a corridor as an urban transformation tool and mobility corridor, not simply something to move people around, because there's nobody to move, you know, then the mobility is not going to help. I mean, that will be my continuous push in the steering committee, you know, where we are trying to take this. Mobility is a tool for a bigger goal. It's not a mobility in itself. And that's what we need to make sure we don't forget.
Thank you so much, and for bringing in the broadband piece. That digital divide is critical and also must be part of our discussion points. And I know that Barbara Benham, you have your hand up, and then after that, we'll come to you, Michael Wilkos. Thank you, from Huntington. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Yarma, for all that wisdom. That was very helpful, and for all the quality information presented here today. I had a request and a question. And during Stephen's presentation, he, on the peer cities and the kind of the competitive landscape, went through some statistics about the percentage of riders using public transit, the transit available. It's a little quick for me, but I think having that view of some of the statistics for the peer cities would be very helpful, so we can maybe do a little bit of apples to apples for our ultimate recommendation. I just wanted to put that out there. And then I wanted to ask, Rory talked about high injury networks, and I'm thinking ahead about kind of selling this to the public and maybe at some point helping unpack that for us, what causes those high injury networks and how is what we're doing kind of solutioning. So those are just two maybe information requests. And then my real question is, does Austin wish they would have asked for more than 7 billion? Like, how is that viewed?
I'm not sure if that question is directly or universally directed to me, but I'll take a swing at it. A couple of quick things. I appreciate the appetite for information. One of the things that I hope you'll have the opportunity to review is the State of Mobility report. You'll find that there's a wealth of information, some of which was portrayed during today's meeting. There's even more in there. And it's been intentionally authored so that it's kind of quick at a glance. You all are busy. You've got full-time jobs. We know that we don't want to make you researchers. So with any luck, you'll find favor with the way that that's organized. You'll find a peer cities selection in that report, and it gives you a lot of information about how we compare here in Central Ohio. I'm not sure whether Austin wishes they asked for more. I think that there's always a difficult balance between asking for too much and building the coalition of support necessary to find favor with the voters. And so I'll leave that to folks who are smarter than I am to determine how you best gauge that. But suffice it to say, they definitely had a fairly regimented and disciplined approach to this. They started with a comprehensive plan called Imagine Austin. It set the tone. It was the North Star. Underneath that were all the supporting initiatives that needed to simply support the idea of their strategy, which was a compact and connected Austin. They kept it simple. And so there's a transit plan called Project Connect, and then there's the strategic mobility plan, and then there's the housing initiative, and the list goes on and on and on. They all are done with one thing in mind. How do we support the policy goals and objectives of Imagine Austin? Now, keep in mind that that's a city-led initiative. And so we're talking about a much larger region here. One of the things that certainly is going to be important as you consider moving forward in this process is all the things that Yamir had mentioned, which is the connectivity between issues. And I think everyone here gets that this is not just simply about creating transportation choice. And in fact, it's really not about transportation at all. This is really about leveraging transportation investment to move the needle on the things that matter most to this region. The reality of it is that we're finally figuring out as planners that it's not an ends to a mean. It's not simply about transportation, but it's one of the most the largest investments that we make in any given region. And therefore, if we know that we can't fix congestion, for example, then we should ensure that every dollar we spend on transportation should do as much community good as it possibly can. I think that that's a good goal. And that requires us to understand the relationship of what transportation access can do to the people that we serve. And creating increased access to opportunity is, I think, key and fundamental among which, but it's only one piece of the equation. Getting back to Austin and some of the things that Yamir had even mentioned, the confluence of initiatives, a coordinated strategy requires that you look at the supply side, which is transportation, building transportation systems, and marrying it with the demand side, which is really land use and people, right? And so we've got to know our growth strategy, where and how we want to grow. We also need to ensure that our government structure, our codes and policies are supportive of that. And that's one thing that a lot of cities are better preparing themselves for at this moment when compared to moments in the past. That's why you see Minneapolis changing their land development process. That's why Charlotte just amended their exclusionary zoning. And that's why you'll see things like Austin looking at things in a more holistic way. It's a long answer, I apologize, but there's a lot to unbundle in there.
It is. And one of the things that we'll do in our next meeting is really do a deeper dive on those peer cities and really get you some of that information that you requested, Barbara. And so Yarmir also mentioned that, you know, we started with growth, and it wasn't about transportation. It was about addressing the growth when we did Insight 2050 and Next Gen and all of those. And so I know, Michael, you've been talking about the census, and you've been kind of unpacking some of that data and what that means to the work that we're getting ready to embark upon. So I'll toss it to you for your question and comment.
Sure, thank you. I just want to make a couple observations. Gail and I were having a conversation in the chat, but for the last 4.5 days, we've had new data. And so people like Aaron Prosser and Matt Martin and Josh Lapp and staff over there at Morpsey, Jennifer Nolan, Aaron Schill, this is a dream come true when census data comes out. But I had a conversation with Karina Johnson with Convergence Columbus just a couple hours ago about how much our city has changed. And I just want to give a couple anecdotes that have motivated me to and be appreciative of this work and the task we have to shape how our city grows in the future. We just learned last Thursday that the decennial census, Columbus had the largest numeric increase in our history in a decennial census, growing 119,000 people. And as a percentage growth, it was the fastest growth in our city since the 1950s. But some really interesting things revealed themselves. So as you look at every single census tract that runs east from downtown along this corridor, of those 22 census tracts, 19 of them are growing already. And how much this transportation infrastructure will be significant in guiding how and the type of development that happens on that east corridor. And then you look at the west corridor on Broad Street, and almost every single one of those census tracts is losing people in an environment of rapid and accelerated population growth because of chronic disinvestment, because of all these historical things that were in the beginning of the presentation, and why transportation and transit infrastructure is going to be so critically important to the west side. And another couple quick anecdotes. The housing vacancy rate in Franklin County dropped significantly as revealed in the census. And in fact, and believe it or not, Franklin County reported a lower housing vacancy rate than San Francisco County in the 2020 census. These are significant. Linden is growing for the first time in 70 years, despite the fact that every single census tract in Linden actually saw a slight reduction in actual housing units. Every census tract but one in Linden has more people living in it than 10 years ago. And the one that showed a reduction was down by 0.2%. And all of the census tracts in Northland, which were essentially flat with housing units, have seen 10 to 25% increase in people, as what we're seeing a complete reversal of what has been a fewer and fewer people living in a housing unit. That trend has stopped and it has been reversed in huge portions of our city as we're seeing massive demographic shifts. So I couldn't be more excited and more thrilled that this work is happening now. It's happening now on the cusp of all of this data release. I think we have a lot of work to do, but I couldn't be more thrilled that we're doing it at this moment in time in Columbus, and we can be empowered by this data and who's in the room to make it change that future growth in the most meaningful way. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights and for sharing. And the time is now, as many of us have said in our presentation. And so Kathy, I know you've had your hand up. If you want to have some comments or some insights for us, please.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to the presenters and this really well put together presentation. This has been incredibly informative, and it's obvious Columbus has done a lot of thinking about this that we have to build on. I have 3 comments. I'll make each one of them brief. The first one is about funding. Let's get that federal funding while we can. And then it sounds like we may be thinking about a local, some kind of referendum. So I want to speak, I'm representing the Sierra Club here. We worked on the Columbus Aggregation Initiative, and it was very interesting to see the broad support in Columbus for transit and transportation initiatives. We can build on that, but we had a lot of support for renewable energy, but we still had to educate people through that campaign. So just be aware, we would have to run a really strong campaign, and with all the educational components that have been talked about here. Second point is about the Climate Action Plan, which I have been part of and working on. So if you look at it, over the last 10 years or so, Columbus has been measuring its emissions, and they stayed rather steady. Emissions from buildings are going down due to energy efficiency, but emissions from transportation are going up because people keep moving here and they keep driving their gas cars. So LinkUS will be critical to actually reducing Columbus's emissions. And as we've seen in the recent IPCC report, I mean, before then we were telling the city, the science says we have to cut emissions in half by 2030. The recent report says we even have to do more than that. We're out of time to stop using fossil fuels. LinkUS and electrifying the transportation through it is going to be really critical. And then just point 3 has to do with the regionalism of LinkUS. And we've talked about linking to other cities or in the area and working, county-wide and maybe even beyond Franklin County. I happen to live on the southwest side, and I'm seeing spokes with LinkUS going north-south, east-west, northeast, northwest, and it's just a blank southwest on everything. And Grove City is one of the largest and fastest growing suburbs. We need to make sure that all of our suburbs are linked in with LinkUS to make all of those connections. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much for those points. And we have a question in the chat that I'll ask in a little bit too, asking about that regional perspective and what we're doing in that space. And we are working in that space. And so I thought I saw Sandy's hand up. Oh, good. Yes, I do. If you want to share, Sandy, some questions or insights.
Yeah, so maybe my question is actually going to be along the lines of what you just touched on, Gail. So first of all, thanks to everybody. I guess my question relates to the regional perspective, the work that we're doing with the Franklin County Rise Together, as well as all the housing policy, the regional housing study, everything we're trying to do. We're trying to take a regional approach, and that is actually very, very tricky. It's not as simple as it sounds. And I'm sure we all have thoughts and opinions about that. But I guess I'm not sure who my question is for, actually. I'm curious if anybody can address what we are doing here. And I'm not trying to nail it down right now. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this a little bit as we talk about ideas and funding and collaborating on this. Are the suburban communities going to be part of this, or are they part of this in the future? If someone could just help me with that. Again, not trying to detail, it just wasn't clear about that today.
Absolutely. I am going to ask Kim to talk about some of the work that we've been doing in that space. And of course, Director Murdoch, if you're still here, anything you wanted to add to that as well. Kim?
Sure, great question. And yes, I think that was earlier. A lot of the earlier planning efforts are definitely more regional in scale with Insight 2050. Next Gen is the CODA service area, which includes all the municipalities within the region, as well as Insight the corridor concept. So LinkUS is regional in scale, and you are right, it's complex, but it's really important that everyone feels a part of this and contributes to what this really means. With that, I think William is going to add more insight to that.
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks, Kim. Yes, the answer to your question is the suburbs have been engaged, both regionally through the work that we do at Morpsey with the housing strategy and with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, but specifically with these corridors. If you look east-west, Bexley, Whitehall, Renensburg have been extremely involved. Going to the northwest, those same communities have been involved along those lines. So we would anticipate continued significant involvement. And that, I know, Sandy, you may be thinking, well, what does that mean in terms of development strategies and housing along those corridors? And I think that's part of the effort too, is we've said it a couple of times, this isn't just about transportation, this is about changing the development dynamic along these corridors. So there's more work to be done, but certainly I think all of those communities are thinking that way and working on it.
Thank you. Thank you. And so Chad from Nationwide, good to see you. Thank you for being here, representing our foundation's work. So I know you have a question and maybe some insights as well.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. And thank you to all the presenters for a very comprehensive approach today. It's a lot, but I'm taking away it's a very integrated approach to growth, trying to pick up on Yarmar's remarks. A couple of things really popped out to me, and maybe we can expand upon it in the future, but the 10% of the roadways that are, causing, maybe for a number of reasons, a higher level of safety incidents is noteworthy. I also would like to lift up safety as we think about pedestrian traffic with sidewalks and also the bike traffic, so on bike paths or on streets with bike designated lanes. I cringe every time I drive around the city and people are walking on berms with a significant lack of sidewalks we have throughout the city. And I realize we can't sidewalk every neighborhood and every major artery, but would like to learn more about where safety integrates with investing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That certainly has been a part of the conversation. I know Rory or Justin or anyone from the city want to talk about sidewalks and that piece and how we're looking to integrate that work as part of our LinkUS programming and planning efforts.
Yeah, Gail, I can touch on that. One of the slides that I presented had a series of maps on it, and that included what we call the high injury network. There are a couple of versions of that. One MORPC analyzed as part of the Central Ohio Transportation Safety Plan in 2019, and that was a precursor to the City of Columbus's focused effort on the Columbus jurisdiction with our Vision Zero action plan that we released earlier this year. And that 10% statistic comes from the Vision Zero action plan, actually. And as we're doing this technical review of these existing plans and prior studies, that includes our high injury network, both at the regional and the local scale. And what we're doing is developing some, we're calling it filtering criteria or screening criteria. What are some important considerations to help inform what we might think about as priorities? Safety, presence on a high injury network is one of those items, whether it's a section of a roadway corridor or a high crash intersection. Those are red flags that we need to be looking at infrastructure investments and design improvements. So among many other screening factors, as well as first mile, last mile access to the transit corridors or to the Central Ohio Greenways, or presence in what we call in the Vision Zero Action Plan, a community of interest and equity screening for communities that have been historically disinvested in. We're taking all of those criteria together as part of our technical analysis to inform these priority networks that we're referring to, and that will be the information that we bring back to you at your next meeting.
Excellent, thank you. And we did have a question in the chat as well. I think we may have touched on it, but I know, Andrew, you had a question about our density strategy and how we create the frequency of a rapid transit system, what's needed in that. And then also you also had a question about the municipalities and how they're working. And I think we've addressed that one, but what about a density strategy to create the frequency a rapid transit system will need? Any of our technical experts want to respond to that?
I'm not sure if Kevin Wheeler was able to join us. He's leading our zoning code effort at the city. Obviously, that issue is bigger than just the City of Columbus. It's multi-jurisdictional, but there certainly is a coordinated effort happening with currently the first phase analysis of the zoning code at the City of Columbus level, which will inform next steps. And Kevin, if Kevin joined, please jump in. I know we have Aaron Prosser here as well, leading our housing efforts, which is tied very closely to the zoning effort. But there's a recognition that as that work moves forward, a focus on updating our zoning policy, specifically in our high capacity transit corridors, to align with the needs for pursuing federal funding, because that's one of the considerations in pursuing capital investments grants funding through the FTA, is showing that coordinated transit-oriented development is established by right through zoning and development policy. So that is a really core aligned effort.
And Gail, if I could add on to that, which helps emphasize the surrounding cities' participation much earlier in the process, when I was still with the City of Westerville, and our CODA board chairman, Craig Treniff, is here. He's also an elected official of a suburban community. In some zoning code work in that city was developing a zoning code overlay of unlimited density for mixed-use developments within a quarter-mile of transit stop locations. And that's just an example of one city's zoning code amendment to allow for density around transit stops. And I think that would be the encouragement throughout the region.
Excellent. Thank you. And I know we've had requests for a list of the members. We'll make sure we send that back out to you as well, the list of the executive committee, the list of the steering committee members, so you all have that as part of our follow-up as well. Any other questions or any other insights? Before I close out, I'd like to offer our chairs any parting thoughts. Director Gallagher or President Pinkerton or Executive Director Murdoch, if you want any closing comments before I give us our next steps and our charge for our next meeting.
Gail, this is William. I appreciate everybody being so focused on this, staying with us through the dense information. The team that has been working on this deserves so much credit for getting us to this point and positioning us to even ask this question, can we do this? I think, Gail, the closing comment would be, if we don't do this, it's not going to happen. And we want to make sure that it's right and that it's more than just transportation that addresses things. But the federal government's not going to do it for us. They might give us the funding. The state's not going to do it for us. It really has to be Central Ohio and the leaders on this call. So don't look over your shoulder to see if somebody else is going to do it. This is the group that's going to advance it forward. So we really appreciate you being part of this and moving it forward.
Thank you so much.
Gail, I was just going to say that Director Gallagher had to leave, so she's not here, but we're just really excited about the enthusiasm and expertise of the group that's part of our steering committee. And I did see that that Yarmer Steiner did have a question that he wanted to talk to us about as well, but looking forward to working with everybody on this.
Wonderful.
Can I say a word, Gail? Just a short one.
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard the comments about multiple municipalities getting involved, I want to remind something that we had at the end of the corridor study. And this is the creation of a Lincus template of what a corridor looks like. So it's not the template of Westerville, it's not the template of Reynoldsburg, it's not the template of City of Columbus, but it's a template prepared by Lincus, who says that a high mobility corridor has a dedicated transit lane, has broadband, has entitlement policies of a certain type, has form-based codes, has affordable housing requirements, the ideal model. Because if you look at the history of the world, of the United Nations, notions like genocides, crime against humanity were invented at the collective level, not at the state level. It was not America who invented crime against humanity and then someone else adopted it. It was the United Nations who promoted that concept. Or Lincus is a little bit like the United Nations. And I think it would have much more credibility if a template was created and then proposed, to all the municipalities to adopt as a whole, as a part. I know I'm getting very practical and technical here, but I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. I think you saw all of us capturing that in our notes. So we certainly will add that to our consideration. And we see that, Aaron, we see your questions, and Josh, and your questions and thoughts for us to bring back to our meeting next week. In September the 21st. And so we are going to do a deeper dive on funding and funding strategy and options there, as well as some benchmarks and analysis. We'll be talking through that as well. So thank you for asking those questions. Any other questions or thoughts? I want to remind you that we do have our next meeting on September 21st. It is from 3 to 5, and it will be a virtual in this setting as well. If you have any other thoughts as you go through any of the data points, please send them my way, send them to any of your other colleagues with whom you engage on a regular basis, and we'll begin to make sure that we're responding to your requests as well as we drive to our agendas. And so we really do want to thank you for your time today. Yes, this has been recorded and it will be online at the LincUsColumbus.com. We will also have the presentation online so that you can access it and really do a deeper dive on your own. And remember, there's a lot of information in the resource page online as well. And so as we close, we just want and ask you to remember that your role as a steering committee member is really key to moving us to the implementation of this program. And so as the mayor said in his video, we want you to be bold. We want you to really push us. We want you to really be innovative and also think about those things that are very strategic and comprehensive. As many of you have said, it's much bigger than mobility. It's much bigger than transportation. And so we really have to use that as our lens, along with that equity lens in everything that we do. And so we want to define mobility investments that really underscore our expectations, what we want this region to be in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and really focus on that funding strategy. I know many of you have said that is critical, it's key, and you heard what Austin did, and I am competitive too. So we want to do, we want to move this in a way that really does move all people. And so through your work, we do anticipate a playbook, or what we'll call a plan of action that we will present to the executive committee, and that will help drive this community forward in ways that we've not seen before. And so we're excited, and I know you've seen that in all of our presentations today. We are so thrilled to have such a diverse group of expertise around the table to help drive this for us. And so we just want to say thank you. And we'll make sure that we follow up with of course, the notes from the day. You'll be able to access the video. And with that, colleagues, if I've missed anything, ping me. But otherwise, I think we're going to say, we're going to give you 2 minutes back. How about that? And we look forward to our work together. It's a journey that's so important to lifting all people in our community. And we thank you for your time today.